Now, at 81 years old, I'm sitting here on my porch while the evening haze of Georgia rolls in like memories I can't shake. And I have to tell you all something that's been chewing on my soul for over 60 years. My husband used me 7 times a day, every single day, and I thought it was about his hunger for me. But good Lord, it was something so much sicker than I could have ever imagined. My name is Alma Kessler, and if you were to drive through Falk Creek tomorrow morning, you'd see me watering my prize-winning roses, the same ones that won me first place at the county fair 3 years in a row. The folks here know me as the quiet widow, the one who makes the best applesauce in 3 counties, the woman who never misses Sunday service, and always sits in the 3rd pew from the front, on the left side. You see my clean house, my pressed clothes, the way I wave from my yard when you drive by. You think you know me, but this town, with its church bells ringing every hour and the sweet smell of honeysuckle climbing up my fence posts, it has kept my secret longer than some of these folks have been alive. The sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the low chatter from the local tavern on Main Street, even the way the evening light falls through my lace curtains. It all feels like a lie now, as if I've been living in a costume that doesn't fit right. Because under all this normalcy, under this life I've built from the ashes of what happened, there is a truth so dark that these good Christian folk would cross the street if they saw me coming. I made a promise to myself this morning, as I listened to the same mockingbird that's been singing outside my window for 5 springs. I promised to finally tell the whole story. The real story, not the polished version I've carried around like a stone in my chest. Because there comes a time when silence doesn't protect anyone anymore. It only protects the lie, and that's what I need from you. Whoever is listening to this old woman's confession, I need you to stay with me, through the ugly parts, through the parts that will make you want to turn away. Because this isn't just my story anymore. This is the story of what happens when evil wears a husband's face, when a 17-year-old girl is sold to pay debts, and when silence becomes its own kind of prison. If you have the stomach for the truth, if you can bear to hear about the real hunger that lived in my house, then pull up a chair and listen close, because I'm about to tell you how I survived hell, and why it took me 64 years to understand what was really happening to me in that bed with the scratchy sheets and the smell of old wood that still haunts my dreams. You have to understand something about the year 1942 in rural Georgia. Times were harder than old leather, and when your daddy gets consumption and can't work the fields anymore, well, then there aren't many options for a family like ours. We had 20 acres of good farmland, but good land means nothing when there's no money for seed, and the man from the bank is knocking every other week with his papers and his cold eyes. I was 17 that spring, just turned in March when the cherry trees started to bloom. And I thought I knew what my life would look like. I thought I'd marry Michael Baker from down the road, the boy with the crooked smile who always left wildflowers on our porch steps. I had dreams, simple dreams of Sunday dinners and babies crawling on clean floors and maybe even a little vegetable garden behind a white house with blue shutters. But dreams don't pay debts. And when Daddy started coughing up blood real bad, Mama sat me down at our kitchen table, that old oak table that wobbled on one leg, and told me about the offer that had come from Conrad Richter. Now, Conrad owned nearly half the county, had money going back 3 generations, and at 60 years old he was looking for his 3rd wife. His second, Eleonora, had died in childbirth just 2 years before. Folks said he was getting lonely in that big house on the hill. He's offering to settle the farm's debts and get your daddy the medicine he needs, Mama said. Her hands were shaking as she poured the chicory coffee, which was all we could afford. All he wants in return is for you to be his wife. I remember how the late afternoon sun was falling through our kitchen window, making everything look golden and peaceful, while my whole world was collapsing around me. Marrying Conrad Richter meant safety, meant Daddy might live, meant my younger brother could finish school instead of working the fields until his hands bled. It also meant saying goodbye to every dream I'd ever had of love. But what nobody told me, what I wouldn't understand until I was already trapped in that house with its heavy curtains and rooms that always smelled like pipe tobacco and something else I couldn't name. Something sweet and sour at the same time, like flowers left too long in a vase. Nobody warned me that Conrad's hunger wasn't the normal kind of desire that happens between a man and a woman. Nobody prepared me for the way his eyes would look right through me, as if I were just a ghost wearing the shape of someone else. The wedding was small, just immediate family and a few neighbors, held right in our good parlor with Pastor Schneider reading from his worn-out Bible. I wore Mama's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the bust, and I remember how the lace felt scratchy at my neck, like it was already trying to choke me. Conrad stood beside me in his best black suit, smelling of bay rum and something medicinal. And when he put the gold ring on my finger, his hands were cold as a January morning. That first night, as he led me up the stairs to what was now our bedroom, I thought I was ready. Mama had given me the talk that morning, all in stuttered words and with red cheeks, about a wife's duties, and how it might hurt at first, but would get easier. What she hadn't prepared me for was the ritual of it. The way Conrad took out his pocket watch and checked the time, like he was timing a horse race. The way he folded his clothes precisely on the chair by the window, and never looked at me once, while I changed into the nightgown he'd laid on the bed. A nightgown that had belonged to Eleonora, and still smelled faintly of her lavender water. 7 times on that first day, 7 times he called me into that room with the heavy burgundy drapes, and the bed that creaked like it was crying. In the morning, mid-morning, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, at night, and again just before dawn. Each time the same, methodical, silent, his eyes fixed on something over my shoulder, as if he were seeing someone who wasn't there. I told myself this was just how marriage was, that older men perhaps had different needs, that I would get used to it. But there was something in his touch that felt angry. Something in the way he gripped my shoulders that spoke of punishment instead of passion. And when it was over, when he would roll off me and immediately get dressed again, I would lie there listening to the grandfather clock in the hall count down the time until his return. And I wondered what kind of hunger has to be fed 7 times a day and never seems to be satisfied. The other wives in town, when I saw them at the general store or after church, gave me those knowing looks, as if they shared a secret joke about newlyweds in the honeymoon period. But this didn't let up. It didn't settle into something normal and comfortable. If anything, Conrad's need seemed to grow stronger, more desperate, as if he were trying to fill a hole that just kept getting deeper, and that's when I started to suspect that I might not be his wife at all, but something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for yet, something that made my skin crawl even when he wasn't touching me. But I had no idea. Sitting there in that big house with its polished floors and heavy furniture, that what I was experiencing wasn't desire at all. It was revenge, and the person he was really punishing wasn't even alive anymore. Living with Conrad was like sharing a house with a thunderstorm that never quite breaks. All that heavy pressure in the air, the waiting for the lightning to strike. The man I had married wasn't cruel in the ways you might expect. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on me in anger. He provided for me well, made sure I had nice dresses for church and enough money for groceries. To the outside world, we looked like any other married couple walking down Main Street on a Sunday morning. But inside that house, I learned the difference between a husband and a keeper. Conrad had routines that dictated every minute of our days. Schedules more precise than the train that came through Falk Creek at 2:41 every afternoon. He woke up at 5:30 a.m. on the dot, got dressed in the same order every day. Underwear, undershirt, trousers, shirt, suspenders. And then he would turn to me with those winter sky blue eyes and say, "Time, Alma." Just those 2 words, as if I were an appointment in his calendar. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath. Everything spotless, everything in its place. Heavy drapes kept out too much sunlight, leaving the rooms feeling dim even at noon. I dusted the same mahogany furniture every morning, polished the same silver frames with pictures of people I didn't know, swept floors that never seemed to get dirty. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it, broken only by the ticking of that grandfather clock and Conrad's measured footsteps as he moved from room to room, as if he were patrolling something. He went about his business, managing his properties, seeing to his tenants, handling money matters in his study, and I went about mine, which mostly meant waiting. Waiting for the next time he would appear in whatever room I was in and say those 2 words. Waiting for the meals we ate in silence while he read his farming journals. Waiting for bedtime, when he would blow out the lamp and turn his back to me as if I wasn't even there. The strangest part was the way he would sometimes look at me when he thought I wasn't watching. Not with desire or even affection, but with this calculating expression, as if he were comparing something about me to something in his head, as if I were failing a test I didn't even know I was taking. I started talking to myself, just to hear a human voice in that silent house. Started humming church hymns while I worked, just to fight back against the quiet. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and hardly recognize the girl looking back, thin as a fence post, her eyes too big for her face, always looking startled like a rabbit caught in a field. But it wasn't until I found the loose floorboard in the upstairs closet that I began to understand I wasn't the first wife to live this particular kind of life in Conrad Richter's house. It was a Tuesday, late October when I found it, or maybe it was a Wednesday. My memory of the exact day is blurry, but I remember clear as yesterday that the maple tree outside our bedroom window had turned the color of dried blood. And there was that first real hint of winter in the air, the kind that makes you want to wrap up tight and hide. I was looking for an extra blanket, something to ward off the chill that seemed to live in the bones of that house, no matter how much wood Conrad put in the fireplace. The upstairs linen closet was one of the few places in the house that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else, probably because it was just practical shelves and folded fabric. Nothing fancy or intimidating. I was reaching for the top shelf, standing on my toes, when my hand brushed against something that didn't feel like fabric. The floorboard underneath it was loose, warped just enough that when I put pressure on it, it gave a little. Now, I wasn't a nosy type by nature. Daddy always said curiosity killed more than just cats, but something about that loose board was calling to me. Like a whisper in church you can't quite ignore. Maybe it was the loneliness talking. Or maybe it was the way this house made me feel like I was living in someone else's shadow. But I found myself prying at the board with my fingernails until it came up. Underneath was a small hollow, maybe the size of a cigar box. And inside that hollow was something wrapped in faded blue cloth that smelled like old roses and dust. My hands were shaking. Lord God, I don't know why, but they were shaking hard as I unwrapped what turned out to be a leather-bound book, small enough to fit in my palm, with a brass clasp that had turned green with age. The moment I opened it and saw the careful handwriting on the first page, property of Eleonora Richter, 1940, my heart started to pound so loud I was afraid Conrad would hear it downstairs in his study. This was her diary, his dead wife's diary, hidden away like some kind of secret treasure. I should have put it back, should have wrapped it in the blue cloth and pretended I'd never found it. But sitting there on the closet floor, with the autumn light filtering through the hallway window, I started to read. And what I found on those pages made my blood run as cold as creek water in January. The first entries were normal enough. Talk of the weather, mentions of town socials and visits to neighbors, the kind of everyday things any wife might write about. But as I read on, turning the pages filled with Eleonora's careful script, the tone began to change. She started writing about Conrad's strange needs, about how he seemed to be punishing her for something she couldn't understand. He looks at me sometimes as if I am someone else, she wrote, as if he is seeing another woman entirely, one who has done him some terrible wrong. And the way, the frequency, it isn't natural. It's as if he is trying to erase something through me, using my body to settle a score I don't even know about. My mouth went dry as I read those words, because they could have been my own thoughts, written down on paper, the same confusion, the same creeping fear that what was happening in our bedroom wasn't about love or even desire, but something darker and more perverse. But it was the last entry, dated just 3 days before Eleonora died, that made me understand I was in real danger. Her handwriting was different here, shakier, as if she'd been terrified while writing it. I found the photograph today. I know what he thinks I've done, and I know he will never forgive me. I'm carrying his child, but he looks at me as if I'm carrying another's. God help me. I think he means to punish this baby for my supposed sins. I have to get out of here before... The entry just stopped, mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. Or maybe she just hadn't been able to find the words for the awful realization that had come to her. And as I sat there in that closet, with her diary in my hands and Conrad's footsteps moving around downstairs, I finally understood what I was really dealing with in my marriage. I wasn't Conrad Richter's beloved wife. I was Eleonora's replacement in a sick game of vengeance that he had been playing long before I ever set foot in his house. And if I didn't find out what he thought she'd done, I might end up just as dead as she was. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about Eleonora's words, about the photograph she'd mentioned and what it could mean. Every time Conrad's breathing settled into that deep rhythm that meant he was truly asleep, I'd stare at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle of what kind of woman my husband thought he had married. It was sometime around 3 a.m. I know because I heard the grandfather clock chime in the hall, that I made the decision that would change everything. I slipped out of bed, quiet as a church mouse, and tiptoed barefoot back to that closet. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure it would wake the dead. The diary was still there, where I'd hidden it back under the loose board, but this time I took it with me, down to the kitchen where I could light the oil lamp and read properly. What I found in the remaining pages made me understand that Eleonora hadn't just been imagining things, she had been living the same nightmare I was, only she had figured out the why before it killed her. The entries from her last few months painted a picture of a woman slowly breaking under the weight of her husband's unexplained anger, and the growing certainty that he believed her unborn child wasn't his. "He's counting," she wrote in one entry that made my hand shake. "I've realized he's counting the days, calculating when the baby was conceived, and somehow he's convinced himself it happened during a time he thinks I was unfaithful. But I was never unfaithful. I've never even looked at another man. The only time I was away from the house was when I went to Atlanta for 3 weeks in May to nurse my sick sister, and he knows that. He drove me to the station himself." I had to stop reading and put my head in my hands, because the horror of it was starting to make sense. Conrad wasn't just a man with an unusual appetite for his wife. He was a man who had convinced himself his wife had cheated on him. And every single time he brought me into that bedroom, he was somehow trying to undo what he believed she had done. I was paying the price for another woman's imagined sins, but it was the next entry that nearly made me drop the diary. "I found where he keeps it, the photograph he thinks proves my guilt. It's in his study, locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. It's a picture of me, talking to a man at the train station in Atlanta. Just talking. Nothing more. But somehow Conrad has twisted it into proof of an affair that never happened. The man was just asking for directions, but in Conrad's mind, that moment of conversation has become proof that I am carrying another man's child. The very last entry was just 2 lines, written in a hand so shaky I could barely decipher it. The baby is coming early. Conrad says if it doesn't look like him, he'll know for sure what I am. God help us both." Eleonora had died giving birth to a baby that, according to the town records I'd seen at the courthouse, looked exactly like Conrad Richter. She died being punished for a betrayal that existed only in her husband's sick imagination. And now I was living in her place, enduring the same punishment for the same imagined crime. As I sat there in that kitchen, with the flickering oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls, I finally understood the true horror of my situation. I wasn't just married to a man with strange needs. I was married to a man who had already driven one wife to death with his paranoid delusions, and now he was slowly killing me the same way. The worst part was the realization that hit me like a physical blow. If Conrad could convince himself that Eleonora had been unfaithful based on nothing more than a photo of her talking to a stranger, what would stop him from finding similar evidence against me? What innocent moment from my past would he twist into proof of betrayal? And what would he do to me when he decided I was just as guilty as he'd convinced himself Eleonora was? I was still sitting there with those terrible questions spinning in my head when I heard footsteps on the stairs and realized Conrad had discovered I wasn't in our bed. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs, and I could feel Conrad standing there in the dark, listening. My whole body went stiff as a fence post, and I had just enough time to blow out the oil lamp and shove Eleonora's diary down the front of my nightgown before I heard him moving toward the kitchen. "Alma!" His voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Not angry, really, but with that cold control that somehow felt worse than yelling. "What are you doing down here?" I pressed my back against the kitchen chair, feeling the leather binding of the diary dig into my ribs, and tried to make my voice sound normal. "Couldn't sleep," I managed to whisper. "Thought some warm milk might help." He appeared in the doorway like a ghost, his white nightshirt making him look pale and otherworldly in the moonlight coming through the window. For a long moment, he just stood there, studying me, and I could feel those winter sky-blue eyes cataloging every detail. My bare feet, my shaking hands, the way I was holding myself too stiff and careful. "You're cold," he said finally, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite place, almost like concern, but twisted somehow, as if he were worried about damage to something that belonged to him, rather than truly caring about my well-being. "Yes," I said, because it was true. I was trembling all over, though not just from the cold. He came closer, so close I could smell the bay rum he used on his hair, and something else underneath. something sour and medicinal that seemed to cling to his skin. When he reached out and touched my cheek with the back of his hand, I had to bite my tongue to keep from flinching. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said, so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "The way you move, the way you hold your head." Eleonora had that same delicate way about her. The diary felt like it was burning against my chest, and I wondered if he could somehow sense its presence. If guilty was written on my face in letters big enough for him to read even in the dark. "Folks always said we looked a bit alike," I whispered. Which was true. People had mentioned it at our wedding. How his second and third wives shared the same slender build and dark hair. "Yes," he said, and his hand moved from my cheek to my throat, not squeezing, just resting there, like a reminder of how easily he could hurt me if he chose to. "But you're different too. Stronger, maybe. She was always so fragile, always crying about something." The way he said it, as if Eleonora's tears had been some kind of personal insult instead of the natural reaction of a woman being slowly destroyed by her husband's delusions, turned my stomach. But I just nodded, trying to look like the obedient wife he expected me to be. "Come back to bed," he said, taking my hand in his. "It's late, and tomorrow will be a long day." I let him lead me upstairs. The diary pressed against my body, feeling heavier with every step. As we climbed those creaking stairs, I looked at the family portraits in the hallway, generations of Richters with their stern faces and pale eyes. And I wondered how many other women had walked this same path, carrying secrets that could destroy them if they were discovered. Back in our bedroom, Conrad settled into bed as if nothing had happened. But I could feel him watching me as I climbed in beside him. The mattress dipped under his weight, and when he reached for me, pulling me close against his side, I had to concentrate on breathing normally, on not thinking about the diary pressed between us. "You know I love you, don't you, Alma?" He whispered into my hair, but there was something hollow in the words, as if he were reciting lines from a play he'd memorized but never really understood. "Yes," I whispered back, because what else could I say? But as I lay there in the dark, with his arm around me and Eleonora's secrets burning against my skin, I knew I was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, Conrad would find some innocent moment to twist into proof of betrayal, just as he had with his second wife. And when that happened, I would either end up dead like Eleonora, or I would have to find a way to escape before his paranoid delusions could destroy me too. The question that kept me awake until dawn was whether I was strong enough to save myself, or if I was already too trapped in his twisted game to find a way out. The next few weeks passed like walking on glass, every step careful, every word weighed, knowing that one wrong move could shatter everything. I hid Eleonora's diary in different places around the house, moving it every few days like a dangerous treasure that might explode if discovered. Sometimes I'd slip it behind the flour canister, other times between the mattresses, always somewhere I knew Conrad wouldn't look. But hiding the diary was nothing compared to hiding what I had learned from it. Every time Conrad called me to our bedroom with those two cold words, "Time, Alma," I had to pretend I didn't know what he was really doing. Had to lie there while he used my body to punish a dead woman for crimes she'd never committed. Had to bite my tongue when he would whisper her name in the dark, thinking I was asleep. It was during Sunday service, maybe 3 weeks after I'd found the diary, that I noticed Mrs. Clara Hartmann watching me with her sharp little eyes. Clara ran the church's ladies' circle and had a tongue sharper than her sewing needles, always ready to dissect anyone who didn't meet her standards of proper Christian behavior. After the service, she cornered me by the fellowship hall, her gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. "Alma, my child," she said, in that sickly sweet voice she used when she was about to deliver poison. "I've been meaning to ask, are you feeling all right? You've been looking so pale lately, thin as a beanpole." I forced a smile and smoothed my dress, aware of other women drifting closer to listen. "Just getting used to married life, I suppose. Learning to keep house for a man like Mr. Richter." "Oh, we all know about Conrad's appetites," Clara said, and the way she said it made my skin crawl. His poor first wife, Margarete, used to complain terribly about his demands. And then Eleonora, God rest her soul. She'd come to church some days looking like she'd been dragged through a hurricane. The other women tittered, as if this were all just normal gossip, but I felt ice forming in my veins. They knew. The whole town knew what kind of man Conrad was, and they just stood by and watched while he destroyed 2 women before me. Of course, Eleonora had other troubles too, Clara continued, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets. Near the end, she was acting very strange. Paranoid, you might say. Going through Conrad's things, asking odd questions about his first wife, Margarete. Even went so far as to write letters to Margaret's family back in Ohio, trying to find out why she really died. My blood turned to ice water. Eleonora had been investigating Margaret's death, and now I was the 3rd wife, walking down the same dangerous path. What did she find out? I whispered, hardly daring to ask. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. Nothing good, my child. Nothing good at all. Clara's words about Eleonora investigating Margaret's death haunted me for days after that Sunday service. The idea that Conrad's second wife had been looking into his first wife's death opened up possibilities I didn't want to consider, but couldn't stop thinking about. What if Margarete hadn't died of natural causes, as everyone believed? What if Eleonora had discovered something terrible about her predecessor's fate? I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way conversations would stop when I entered the general store. The way some of the older women would look at me with something that might have been pity. The fact that nobody ever spoke about Conrad Richter, even though she'd only been dead for 8 years. It was as if the whole town had agreed to forget she ever existed. The worst part was how this new knowledge poisoned everything in my daily life with Conrad. When he sat across from me at breakfast, methodically buttering his toast and reading his agricultural reports, I'd find myself studying his hands, wondering what they might have done. When he'd check his pocket watch before calling me upstairs, I'd think about how that same calculated precision could have been used for darker purposes. Even his gentleness started to feel sinister, as if he was being careful with me, the way you're careful with something you plan to break later. But it wasn't until I started exploring the house more thoroughly that I found the first real proof that my fears weren't just paranoia. In the cellar, behind the coal bin where no one would think to look, I discovered a trunk that had been pushed up against the stone foundation. The lock was old and rusty, but determined desperation gave me a strength I didn't know I had, and I managed to break it open with a fireplace poker from the parlor upstairs. Inside were things that had belonged to Margarete. Dresses that smelled of mothballs and old lavender, a pair of delicate gloves, some jewelry that looked expensive, and underneath it all, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely untie the ribbon, but when I finally did and started to read, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. They were love letters, but not from Conrad. They were signed by someone named Jakob, and they were filled with passionate declarations and promises to free Margarete from her unhappy marriage. The dates on the letters showed they had been written in the last few months of Margaret's life. And as I read them, I could feel the desperation of a woman trapped in an impossible situation, torn between duty and a love she'd never expected to find. The last letter was different from the others. Jakob was begging Margarete to leave with him immediately, saying he'd heard rumors about Conrad's first wife, a woman named Susanna, who had supposedly died of a fever, but whose death Jakob thought was suspicious. He wrote how Margarete needed to flee before she became another mysterious tragedy in the Richter family history. But Margarete never left with Jakob, because Margarete died 2 days after that last letter, supposedly of heart failure in her sleep, at 24 years old, a perfectly healthy young woman who had never had any heart trouble. As I sat there in that damp cellar, with those letters in my lap, I finally understood the full extent of what I had walked into. I wasn't just Conrad's 3rd wife. I was potentially his 3rd victim. The man I had married to save my family from poverty was a murderer who had perfected his method over 2 previous marriages. He had driven Eleonora to death with psychological torture, convincing her that her own husband believed she was an adulteress carrying another man's child. But Margarete had been different. Margarete had found real love elsewhere, and that had required a more permanent solution. The pattern became clear, and it terrified me more than anything I had ever imagined. Conrad wasn't just punishing his wives for imagined betrayals. He was eliminating them when those betrayals became real, or when they got too close to the truth of what had happened to their predecessors. And now here I sat, holding evidence in my hands that could destroy him, trapped in a house with a man who had already killed at least twice and wouldn't hesitate to make me his 4th victim if he discovered what I knew. Living with the weight of what I had discovered was like carrying a rattlesnake in my chest. Every breath was dangerous, every move calculated not to disturb the deadly thing coiled up inside me. I put Margaret's letters back in that cellar trunk, but I couldn't put the knowledge back where it came from. It lived with me now, coloring every interaction with Conrad, every meal we shared in silence. Every night I lay beside him, wondering if this would be the night he decided I'd learned too much. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. When Conrad touched my cheek with those pale fingers, I had to stop myself from flinching, knowing those same hands had likely pressed a pillow over Margaret's face or mixed something deadly into her evening tea. When he remarked on how much I resembled his previous wives, I had to smile and nod instead of screaming that I knew exactly why he chose women who looked alike. It made the killing easier when we were all just versions of the same disposable thing. But keeping secrets that big started to wear me down in ways I hadn't expected. I started to lose weight I couldn't afford to lose. My dresses hung loose on a frame that was already too thin. My hands developed a tremor that would show up at the worst moments, like when I was serving Conrad his coffee and the cup would rattle against the saucer for no apparent reason. Sleep became something that happened in fragments, interrupted by nightmares where I was running down endless hallways while footsteps followed behind me, always getting closer until I'd wake up gasping. The turning point came on a Thursday, or maybe it was a Friday. The days had started to blur together in my exhaustion when I was cleaning Conrad's study and found his desk drawer open. Not the locked bottom drawer where Eleonora had said he kept her photograph, but the middle one, where he usually kept his business correspondence. Right there, on top of a stack of bank papers, was an envelope addressed to Dr. Hoffmann in town. And something about the careful way Conrad's handwriting formed the letters made my stomach clench with dread. I knew I shouldn't look. Knew it would be the end of me if I was caught reading Conrad's private mail. But the envelope was already open, just lying there as if waiting to be discovered. And before I could stop myself, I unfolded the letter inside. It was a request for a consultation regarding female hysteria and the available medical treatments for wives who were showing signs of mental instability. Conrad had written a detailed description of symptoms he claimed I was exhibiting: paranoid behavior, weight loss, nervous tremors, sleeplessness, and he was asking the doctor about the possibility of having me committed to the state asylum for my own safety and the safety of others. The letter was dated 2 days prior, which meant Conrad had already decided I was becoming a problem that needed to be solved. He wasn't going to kill me like he'd killed Margarete, and he wasn't going to drive me to death with psychological torture as he had with Eleonora. He was going to have me declared insane and locked away where no one would ever believe anything I said about him. It was brilliant, really, in its calculated cruelty. A woman committed for hysteria could say whatever she wanted about her husband, and the world would just nod sadly and remark on how mental illness can make people believe the most preposterous things. Even if I tried to tell someone about Margaret's love letters or Eleonora's diary, they would only see the ravings of a woman whose mind had broken under the pressure of being married to an older man. As I stood there in his study, with that trembling letter in my hands, I finally understood that I was completely alone in this nightmare. The town would never believe me over Conrad Richter, the respected landowner who had already suffered the tragic loss of 2 wives and was now dealing with the heartbreak of a 3rd wife who was losing her mind. The church women who whispered about his appetites would never imagine he was capable of murder. They would only pity him for having such terrible luck with unstable women. But as I folded that letter and placed it carefully back in the drawer, exactly as I had found it, one thought echoed in my head with crystal clarity. If Conrad thought he could have me declared insane and locked away, he had made his first real mistake. Because unlike his previous wives, I now knew exactly what kind of monster I was married to, and I still had time to do something about it. The question was whether I had the courage to fight back, or if I was going to let him destroy me, just as he had destroyed Margarete and Eleonora. That night, I lay awake listening to Conrad's breathing, planning my escape with the desperate focus of a woman who knows her life depends on getting every detail right. I had maybe a week, 2 at most, before Dr. Hoffmann would examine me and sign the papers Conrad needed to have me committed. After that, I would disappear into that asylum like smoke, and no one would ever question what had happened to Alma Kessler, the poor, unstable girl who couldn't handle being married to such a fine, patient man. But escaping wasn't just about running away. It was about making sure I could never be found, and dragged back to face whatever punishment Conrad had planned for a wife who had discovered his secrets. I needed money, which meant getting into that locked desk drawer, where I suspected he kept more than just Eleonora's photograph. I needed a way to travel, which would be difficult since Conrad controlled the car and knew everyone in town who might give a young woman a ride. Most importantly, I needed proof that would protect me if he tried to track me down, something so incriminating that he would be more afraid of me exposing him than he was angry about me leaving. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Saturday morning, Conrad announced he was riding out to see to his tenants, something that usually took him the better part of the day, as his properties were scattered across 3 counties. After he left, I watched from the kitchen window until his black Ford was out of sight, and then I ran upstairs to get the sewing scissors from my sewing basket. Breaking into that locked desk drawer felt like the most dangerous thing I had ever done, more terrifying than the first time Conrad had called me to our bedroom or the night I'd found Eleonora's diary. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the scissors steady, and every little noise made me freeze, listening for the rumble of his returning car. But desperation gave me strength, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the lock give way with a soft click. Inside was a collection of horrors that confirmed every terrible suspicion I'd developed about my husband. There was Eleonora's photograph, just as she'd written, a perfectly innocent picture of her talking to a stranger at a train station, but with angry notes in Conrad's handwriting scrawled in the margins, calling her a whore and worse things I won't repeat. There were newspaper clippings about Margarete's sudden death, and about Susanna before her, and about a woman named Ruth who had apparently been his first wife, dead at 19 in what the paper called a tragic accident. But it was the small leather-bound journal, tucked in the very back of the drawer, that made me understand the full extent of Conrad's madness. It was his diary, and reading it was like looking directly into the mind of the devil himself. Entry after entry detailed his suspicions about each wife, his growing certainty that they were all unfaithful, his careful plans for how he would eliminate them when their supposed betrayals became unbearable. The entry about Margarete was the worst, a cold, clinical description of how he had suffocated her with a pillow in her sleep, how he had arranged her body to look peaceful, how he had practiced looking grief-stricken in the mirror before calling the doctor the next morning. There were similar entries about Ruth and Susanna, each death disguised as an accident or illness, each murder justified in Conrad's twisted mind as righteous punishment for imaginary sins. The most recent entry was about me, dated just 3 days ago. Alma is showing signs of the same moral weakness as the others. I have seen her going through things that are not her concern, asking questions she has no business asking. The asylum will be a mercy compared to what she deserves for her obvious preparations to betray me, just like all the rest. As I sat there with his journal in my hands, I finally understood that I wasn't just married to a murderer. I was married to a madman who saw betrayal everywhere, who had convinced himself that murdering 4 women was not only justified, but necessary. And worse, I realized my careful snooping hadn't been as secret as I'd thought. He had been watching me, cataloging my suspicious behavior, building a case against me just as he had with all the others. But unlike his previous wives, I now had the evidence to destroy him completely. His journal contained detailed confessions to 4 murders, written in his own handwriting, with dates and methods and justifications that would horrify any court in the land. If I could get it to the right authorities, Conrad Richter would hang for what he'd done. The problem was getting away alive to make sure that justice was served, because just then I heard the distant rumble of his Ford coming up the road, and I knew my time was up. Conrad was coming home early, and I was sitting in his study with his darkest secrets spread out on his desk, like evidence in a courtroom. The sound of the approaching Ford engine sent pure terror through my veins like ice water. I had maybe 2 minutes before Conrad walked through the front door, and here I sat in his study, his murder diary open in my hands, and his desk drawer broken open like a crime scene. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was spinning so fast I couldn't think straight. I shoved his journal down the front of my dress, grabbed Eleonora's photograph and Margarete's letters from the drawer, and tried to make the broken lock look like it hadn't been tampered with. But my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the scissors, and they clattered across the hardwood floor, just as I heard Conrad's footsteps on the porch. There was no time to run, no time to hide the evidence of my discovery. All I could do was smooth my skirts, try to control my breathing, and pray that I could somehow convince him I'd been doing something innocent, like dusting his study furniture. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and I heard him call my name in that controlled voice he always used, the one that sounded polite but had ice running underneath it. When he appeared in the doorway of his study, still in his hat and coat from his drive, I was standing by the window, pretending to be watering the plant on the windowsill. But the moment I saw his face, I knew my act wasn't fooling anyone. Those winter sky blue eyes went straight to his desk, took in the broken drawer, the scattered papers, and then fixed on me with an expression that made my blood run cold. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there studying me, as if I were some kind of specimen he was trying to identify. Then he slowly took off his hat and coat, hanging them on the hook by the door with the same careful precision he used for everything else. When he spoke, his voice was so calm it was more terrifying than screaming would have been. He asked what I had been doing in his study, and I tried to tell him I was just cleaning, that I'd accidentally knocked something over while dusting. But my voice came out as a whisper, and I could feel his journal burning against my ribs where I'd hidden it. He walked to his desk, examined the broken lock, and then turned to me with something that might have been disappointment if it hadn't been so cold. That's when he told me he'd suspected for weeks that I was becoming just like the others, paranoid, suspicious, digging through his private things, looking for proof of infidelity that existed only in my sick mind. He said it sadly, as if he were genuinely sorry to see me going down the same path as Eleonora and Margarete and all the others. He even reached out to touch my cheek, in a gesture that would have looked like comfort if I hadn't known what those hands were capable of. But then his expression changed, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, not just the cold control he usually showed, but actual rage, the kind of fury that had been building behind his careful facade for years and was finally breaking through. He grabbed my shoulders, and his grip was hard enough to leave bruises, hard enough to make me realize the time for pretending was over. He told me he knew what I'd found, knew what I'd read, and that it didn't matter, because no one would ever believe a word I said. He described in detail how he would have me committed to the asylum, how the doctors there had special treatments for women who suffered from hysterical delusions, how I would spend the rest of my short life in a padded room, screaming accusations that would only prove how crazy I really was. But as he spoke, laying out his plans for my destruction with the same methodical precision he used for everything else, I felt something inside me shift. Maybe it was the knowledge that I had his journal pressed against my heart, physical proof of every terrible thing he'd done. Maybe it was the thought of Margarete and Eleonora and all the other women who died because they hadn't fought back. Or maybe it was just that after months of living in fear, I had finally reached the point where anger was stronger than terror. When he had finished his explanation of how my life was going to end, I looked him straight in those pale eyes and told him I knew exactly what kind of monster he was. I told him about his journal, about the detailed confessions he'd written in his own handwriting, about how the whole world was going to find out what Conrad Richter had done to 4 innocent women who had made the mistake of trusting him. The look on his face when I said it was something I will never forget, pure shock, as if he couldn't believe one of his victims had finally found the courage to fight back. But the shock only lasted a moment before it turned into something far more dangerous, and I knew that what happened next would decide whether I would see another sunrise or become the 5th entry in his murder diary. What happened next still sends a shiver down my spine, even after all these years. Conrad's face went through a transformation, like a mask was slipping off, revealing something inhuman underneath. But instead of lunging at me as I had expected, he started to laugh. A sound so cold and empty that it made my skin crawl worse than his anger had. That's when he told me the truth. The one that changed everything I thought I understood about my situation. He said I was right about him being a murderer. Right about Margarete and Eleonora and the others, but wrong about one crucial detail that would make all my evidence worthless. He went to his desk, pulled out a different key, and opened a secret compartment I never even knew existed. Inside was another journal, this one bound in black leather and sealed with a brass clasp. When he opened it, I could see pages upon pages of handwriting, but it wasn't his careful script. It was someone else's entirely. Someone whose handwriting was educated and precise in a way Conrad's had never been. He told me the journal I had stolen from his desk was a fake, planted there for me to find. Just as he had planted Eleonora's diary in that loose floorboard upstairs. Every detail about his supposed murders, every confession I thought would destroy him, had been carefully written to convince me I was married to a murderer, when the truth was something far more twisted and dangerous. The real journal belonged to Dr. Hoffmann, the same man Conrad had written to about having me committed. But Dr. Hoffmann wasn't just the town doctor. He was Conrad's partner in a plot that had been running for years, preying on young women from poor families who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. The asylum wasn't a place where inconvenient wives were locked away. It was the place they were taken to die, their deaths recorded as suicides or accidents, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. Conrad had never actually killed anyone himself. He was just the recruiter, the respectable widower who married desperate girls and then drove them mad with psychological torture until they were ready to be handed over to Dr. Hoffmann for the final phase of their destruction, the key. 7 times a day, the coldness, the constant feeling of being watched and judged. It was all designed to corrode my sanity until I was genuinely unstable enough that no one would question my commitment. But here is the part that nearly stopped my heart. Margarete and Eleonora and all the others, they weren't dead. They were still alive, locked away in a private section of the asylum that Dr. Hoffmann ran like his own personal prison, kept sedated on drugs and forgotten by a world that thought they were dead. I wasn't just facing my own death. I was facing the possibility of spending the rest of my life as a living ghost, trapped with the other women who had made the mistake of marrying Conrad Richter. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but it also gave me something I hadn't had before: hope. If the other women were still alive, then there was a chance to save not just myself, but all of them. And if Dr. Hoffmann was the true monster in this partnership, then Conrad was just a coward, hiding behind someone else's evil. That's when I made the decision that saved my life and the lives of 5 other women. Instead of trying to run or fight, I told Conrad I wanted to make a deal. I said I would go to the asylum voluntarily, if he would allow me to write 1 letter to my family explaining my decision. Something that would make my commitment look voluntary and protect him from suspicion. What I actually wrote was a detailed account of everything I had discovered, including the location of Dr. Hoffmann's private ward and the names of all the women I suspected were being held there. I sealed it in an envelope addressed to my brother. But instead of giving it to Conrad to mail, I slipped it to Mrs. Clara Hartmann at church the next Sunday, telling her it contained my last will and testament, and begging her to make sure my family got it if anything should happen to me. Clara might have been a gossip and a busybody, but she wasn't stupid, and she could read between the lines well enough to understand something was very wrong. 3 days later, when Conrad tried to have me committed, Clara had already contacted the state authorities, demanding an investigation into Dr. Hoffmann's asylum. What they found there was worse than anything I had imagined. Not just the 5 women who were supposed to be dead, but dozens of others from all over the state, women whose families had been told they'd died of various illnesses, when in fact they had been abducted and imprisoned. Dr. Hoffmann had been running his operation for over a decade, and Conrad was just one of several men who helped procure victims for him. The trial made headlines all across the country and beyond. Conrad got life in prison, Dr. Hoffmann was executed, and I got something I never expected to have again, my freedom and my life back. But more importantly, I got the chance to help rebuild the lives of women who had been written off as dead, starting with Margarete and Eleonora, who became like sisters to me in the years that followed. I learned that healing takes time, that nightmares don't just go away because the monster is locked up, but that surviving something that should have destroyed you makes you stronger than you ever could have imagined. I am 81 years old now, and I have spent the last 60 years of my life proving that a woman can not only survive the worst kind of evil, but she can thrive in spite of it. If you are hearing this, and you are trapped in your own nightmare, remember that there is always a way out, even when it seems hopeless, even when the whole world seems to be against you, if you are just brave enough to look for it. Don't let anyone tell you you're crazy because you see the truth, and don't let fear stop you from fighting back when your life depends on it. My story proves that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest, but it also proves that the human spirit is stronger than any evil that tries to break it. I'm still here. I'm still fighting, and I want to hear from you. Share your story if you feel called to, because every voice matters, and every survivor makes the world a little bit safer for the women who come after us. Tell me what city you're watching this from. I'd love to know how far my words are traveling and whose lives they might be touching. And if this old woman's story has moved you, please subscribe to my channel, Clara's Stories, because I have more stories to tell, and together we can make sure that women like Margarete and Eleonora and all the others are never forgotten. If you enjoyed this story and would like to support the continuation of such narratives, I would be very grateful for a small donation. Every contribution helps me continue to find the time and resources to share these important stories. Thank you for your generosity.